Hello, everyone. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. Your host, Jacob Berman. Today, I'm joined by Brian Allen. He is a published scholar, and him and I have spoken about a year ago on David LeBlanc's channel, where we discussed some, but not quite all, the stuff I'm about to talk about here with him today. Um, Today, we're going to be discussing Paul's conflicting beliefs with his opponents, like Cephas and James in Galatians primarily. I'm also going to get into just a little bit, not too much into this, because I want to focus more on Paul's Judaism instead. But what I mean is, I'm going to be getting into a little bit of problems with the dating of the Pauline epistles, which, by the way, I don't want anyone to confuse this with disputing the authenticity, because I don't. I'm not against the seven letters being authentic. Never have. It's more of a question of when in the first century CE is it more probable that Paul wrote his letters rather than the generally accepted idea. But anyway, so let's just get right into it. So, Brian, would you agree that in Galatians chapter 3:1, when Paul says to the Galatians that all of you have been bewitched, you are fools, and then he follows that by saying, "For Jesus has been portrayed as crucified among you." Would you agree that this is a group of people that Paul's arguing with that seem to not accept the crucifixion of Jesus as being that they reject the crucifixion of Jesus as being historical? Do they seem to reject that? Is that why? Would you agree that Paul's angry at them for not accepting the crucifixion and taking it literally?
Yeah, I mean it's a very this verse has been very perplexing to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting way to put it. I would say based on on a face value of reading the verse, it does seem like they may have once believed that, but then are in denial. But yeah, it was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. That's just a whole confusing verse in itself because it's actually reading it, and the Galatians weren't there in Jerusalem watching Jesus on the cross with his brother to the left and brother to the right.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in whatever you have to say about this verse, but I know it doesn't make very much sense. So let's see where you put it.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think to myself, it almost sounds perhaps Simonian or even early Gnostic, because the Gnostics, there are different groups of them, but a lot of them are are very similar to the docetic view that
Mhm.
Jesus never had an earthly ministry. It all happened in heaven, apparently, and only the apostles could see it. Um, and some of that seems to be somewhat implied, although not as eloquently as the later, more advanced Gnostic literature suggests. And like, you have these guys, they can't make up their minds on who was even crucified on the cross. Some of them will say, as Irenaeus noted, some believe Simon of Cyrene was on the cross instead of Jesus, or some others would say it was even Judas Iscariot, like the Gospel of Barnabas suggests, which is written hundreds of years later. Um, and then there's another text, I don't remember what it's called, that actually suggests it was Pilate himself that was crucified, not Jesus, which is I had to giggle when I read that text. Um, and in all these different versions of that story, either way, Jesus seems to escape and ascend directly to heaven and avoids the crucifixion because the other man put on the cross in his place was transformed by the power of God, apparently, to look like Jesus. So it confused the crowd, and they thought, that's Jesus over there, and they go nail him, and the real guy's fleeing to
Mhm.
heaven.
That also ties into not that I'm an expert in this, but that kind of sounds like it would tie into the swoon theory of the resurrection narrative somewhat, right? I could be wrong. I'm not, like I said,
They,
very
typ-
familiar with that.
Typically, that's not. I haven't heard of anyone saying using that as a support for the swoon hypothesis. The people that are that support that theory typically suggest that when Jesus was crucified on the cross, he might have been on drugs or something. So it made it look like his heart stopped beating, made it look like he was dead. And then when he was put in the tomb, he then woke up. I guess he fell into a short coma somewhat because he woke up in 3 days, which is... I think the fact that they try to tap dance around that, they try to bend over what that means, because Paul does talk about the 3 days, not in the same way the Gospels do. He doesn't say that Pilate did it, although there's quite a list of scholars that do think that 1 Timothy is authentic. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, Pilate is mentioned. In fact, it's the only time Pilate's ever mentioned in the 13 letters of Paul, and it says that Jesus confessed before Pilate, which is interesting. But it doesn't say that Pilate ordered the crucifixion of Jesus. But one can't help but to think, like myself, that it could potentially be a pre-gospel allusion to Pilate crucifying Jesus in some way. Because another thing to think about is, in the beginning of 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, also in Philippians, many of Paul's letters, a lot of them, claim to have been offered by several people, not just by Paul, but by Timothy, some by Silas as well, others by Paul and Sophanes in 1 Corinthians. And then in 2
and
Corinthians...
even the end of Romans has, a whole... He's got a secretary, or I forgot the fancy
Romans
word for
16:22. I've actually had a hard time with that in the past, because Tertius, or some would call him Tertius, I think it's... I eventually came to conclude Tertius sounds like a better pronunciation, but anyway, Tertius... What bothers me about Tertius is, unlike the other co-authors, Tertius doesn't claim to be offering it together with Paul. He just says blatantly, I wrote this letter. And then in Romans 1:1 through 7, Paul says, I wrote this letter. So it's kind of a strange text. Romans 16 almost reads to me like it was jammed in there. Like some could even say it was a separate letter. Now, on another note, what I typically think is that Tertius might have been an earlier name, or maybe even a title, a Roman title for Paul. And either way, the secretary thing's possible. I admit that's a possibility. But the way it reads to me is it's not saying that. Like the other letters where, 1 Corinthians says, Paul and Sophanes wrote it together, cool. Or 1 Thessalonians, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. In Romans, it doesn't admit the two wrote it together in any one place. It's either one or the other, but they never appear together, which is quite strange. And if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure in Romans 16, Paul is never mentioned in it. It's just Tertius, which is also another oddity. Romans 16 is actually very short. I could take a look right now to be absolutely certain that I'm remembering correctly.
I'm scared. There's lots of, personal pronouns, I, but
yeah, Paul never shows up in it. Continue what you were saying. I didn't mean to cut you off if I did.
No, it's fascinating. I'm just following the personal pronouns. So you have in Romans 16:1, I command you to our sister Phoebe,
right,
and so on. Then greet this person, greet them, greet everybody. Then you have another I in Romans 16. I appeal you, brothers.
Yeah.
And then the next I is Tertius. I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. So yeah, there's no Paul. The if you follow the I don't know. I mean. But yeah, the I is eventually introduced as Tertius in Romans 16:22. So Paul is not mentioned.
Yeah, that's why I find it to be interesting. It reads as an anomaly to me, at least. Anyway, and then there's the problem in 2 Corinthians 11:32. And in it, Paul says that he fled from Aretas the Fourth, King Aretas IV of Nebatea. And many scholars have noted that, wait a minute, there was no King Aretas IV that ruled Damascus. Now, there are other scholars that say, well, there might be a way to understand 2 Corinthians without contradicting anything that, say, Josephus would say about any of the Aretases. But other scholars note that King Aretas III did rule Damascus about a century before Paul and King Aretas IV. And it seems like I typically think that Paul made a mistake in 2 Corinthians. I think it's kind of a little bit of a grave mistake. I think he confused one for the other Aretas. And then the other thing is, in Josephus tells us when Aretas attacked Jerusalem because he was not happy about Herod Antipas divorcing his daughter Phasaelis, or Phasaelius. Anyway, he attacked because he didn't like what Antipas did. And Antipas fled Jerusalem, and I couldn't help but think to myself, Herod Antipas fleeing Jerusalem sounds awfully alike. Paul fleeing Damascus to get away from Aretas' wrath. And back to Romans 16, ironically, Romans 16:11, it says apparently Paul's a kinsman of the Herods, if Tertius is referring to Paul in that way. And it does look like that to me. And in Acts, Paul's frequently going around seeing high-ranking Roman guys or Roman vassals like Herod Agrippa or Ananias, a son of Nebuchadnezzar. He was a high priest of Jerusalem. He was pro-Roman. And Josephus mentions that same guy. He was executed by the Zealots. They didn't like him very much because of that around when it was 66 CE, start of the war. And Simon Magus, he's another opponent of Peter, interestingly. Peter's supposed to be Cephas, as we all know. And he's, in this guy, they're having a conflict, as some would say is a little similar to Paul's conflict with Peter, and only in this case, it appears that Simon Magus and Peter disagree far more than Paul and Peter did, or Paul and Cephas. And Simon was going around seeing Felix and Drusilla, and Josephus seems to mention this guy in passing, doesn't talk about him too much. Simon the charlatan from Cyprus who went to see Felix and Drusilla. Seems like it's the same guy in Acts, probably somewhat mythologized. And then later in the pseudo-Clementine literature, Gnostic literature, Gnosticism seems to be anachronistically backdated to Simon Magus, and Simon Magus being the mythical founder, when Gnosticism was more like Basilidian and Marcionite than Simon Magus in origin. Now, here's another part here I want to touch on just real quick. Not going to spend too much time on this, so we'll get back to Paul's Judaism and his dispute with the other apostles. In Philippians, when Paul says, I'm writing to Caesar's household, or he's writing from Caesar's household, and the same thing is mentioned in the Epistle to the Romans. In Philippians 4, Paul mentions Clement, which Origen of Alexandria, the church father, thought that was Pope Clement of Rome. And there's other evidence suggesting that this is supposed to be Titus Flavius Clemens. And the symbolism that was used for Pope Clement is the same kind of symbolism used for Flavius Clemens, the dolphin and the anchor, because Eusebius in the 4th century CE said that Clemens was executed using the anchor somehow. I don't quite remember exactly how he said it, but I thought to myself that has to be linked to the archaeology that was done in regards to Flavius Clemens. And Roman historians say that Clemens fled, I think it was from the Flavian household in 68 CE during the year of the 4 emperors. Now here's the problem here that I'm having. Clemens was a child on 68. And according to Origen, this guy is the same one mentioned in Philippians, which I find to be very interesting, especially when in the same letter, Philippians. I think it was in might have been chapter 3, don't quite remember. But it's in the Epistle to the Philippians. Paul says there's another man at Caesar's household that he calls Epaphroditus, which Professor Robert Eisenman believes that's the same Epaphroditus mentioned in by Josephus, whom is also supposedly he's the guy that died around the year 95 CE when he was executed by Domitian. Domitian, I think, about 95 CE, 96 at the latest. He executed this guy, accusing him of having something to do with Emperor Nero's death, which is kind of laughable that he would execute him at that time, about 14 to 15 years into his reign, because Domitian had all that time to execute Epaphroditus, and he could have done so at any point, but he waits until around 95 CE to do it, and that is around the same time that Domitian was supposed to be persecuting the Christians. He was also persecuting other Jews, and that was a lot of exiles happened with people like John of Ephesus and others. Now, another thing is Galatians mentions that Paul spent 3 years with Barnabas, and then after that. Okay, no, he didn't say 3 years like that. Paul said something like 3 years followed by 15 days at Jerusalem. Then 14 years later, he returned to Jerusalem. Something to do with Barnabas. And Josephus mentions a very similar event when he says in Vita 3, or Life 3, paragraph 3, he says you know what, that might have been in paragraph 2. It was either 2 or 3, around the beginning. He says that he spent 3 years with Banus. And Barnabas is a name that, before the New Testament, has not appeared in any of our literature, at least that I'm aware of. It's a practically unique name to the New Testament at the time. And the only other name that sounds just like it is Banus. And according to Josephus, Banus taught him for 3 years. He was in the desert. He appears to have been in Essene. And then, after he's done with the 3 years of Banus, he returns to Jerusalem, kind of like how Paul does after the 3 years. But then 14 years later, just like Paul, he returns to Jerusalem, which was around 70. And, because Josephus acted as a mediator between the Jews and the Romans, trying to convince the Jews they should surrender, trying to defend Jerusalem from the Roman army is pointless. They didn't listen to him. And in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, Paul says the wrath of God has come upon the Jews at last. And in Romans 1, he says the same thing. He says the wrath of God has come upon the unrighteous. And I couldn't help but think to myself, I'm not alone in this, that the wrath of God, and Dr. Price says the same thing, the wrath of God appears to be referring to the destruction of the temple. Added to that,
sense.
Yeah. You said that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
In Philippians 4, Clement, whom wasn't even a major Christian figure until the mid-90s, if we were to take the tradition that he was a pope as being somewhat historical or even quasi-historical, he wasn't an important figure in Christianity until the mid-90s. I highly doubt Paul was writing about a child called Clement that was important enough to be mentioned in the 50s and much. He was a child in the 60s, so I highly doubt he could have mentioned him in the 50s. Probably wasn't even born yet. Probably, if I were to give it a rough estimation, he was probably born around 60. And
yeah, and the way his name is dropped in that verse, whoever is the intended audience of Philippians, it's just dropped, help the women who have labored with me in the gospel together with Clement. Clement full stop. So they know who Clement is. And so if the tradition says that, tradition agrees that he's the Bishop of Rome, he has to be, people are going to know Clement the child. Like, oh yeah, Clement the child who's hanging around Paul. He's this well-known figure. He has to be. So I think you're on
Exactly.
something there.
And then there's Epaphroditus. Josephus says, before I get back to Josephus, I want to bring this up real quick. There are some that will say that, oh, Caesar's household could have been referring to any household. However, Caesar's household, even in Josephus, is used for very high-ranking positions in the Roman government. Primarily, that term is used for the emperor's household. Sometimes it could be a reference to Herod Agrippa, but even if it were that, that's still very, very pro-Roman. On the pro-Roman side of things and Roman government stuff, Roman vassal states. And Paul's going to these people, and it kind of adds up. Caesar's household, Epaphroditus is Caesar's household, Clemens now. Just how many more people that have to be at Caesar's household that lines up with the same people Josephus is mentioning before we say, okay, it's the same group of people. And I think Banus might have been Barnabas. It certainly sounds like it to me. And if they are the same person, which I think they are, that would imply, more than imply, it would pretty much be direct evidence, Josephus and Paul seem to have known each other through Barnabas. And then Paul says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. I believe I think that was in 2 Corinthians, either 10 or 12, I don't remember.
Yeah.
And
Somewhere in 2 Corinthians.
Definitely. 3 times I was shipwrecked, and then he mentions the same 14 years. I'm like, wait a minute now. That sounds like the same 14 years in Galatians. I would find that to be implausible to be a separate 14 years. And if it's the same 14 years, that would mean Paul is definitely aware of the war. The temple has been destroyed. That's why the wrath of God has come upon them at last. That's why he says that. And then here's the other problem. This is my favorite part. Paul seems to be writing to vast churches, and the earliest archaeology for these churches looks like it is to do with the Flavian dolphin and the anchor symbolism that was later adopted into Christianity, which would mean mid-90s. Now, Pope Clement of Rome, when he wrote First Clement to the Corinthians, which the scholars typically say that's authentic, Clement wrote an obituary in it about Paul's death, and he was telling the people of Corinth that Paul had died. He departed from the world. According to late Christian tradition, very, very late Christian tradition, Paul was supposed to have died in his 60s. But the earliest tradition about his death is First Clement to the Corinthians, which seems to suggest his death happened more recently to the letter being written, insinuating mid-90s for his death. And it sounds to me that the bulk, if not all of the letters, appear to be concentrated on many issues, but there's one central issue that Paul gets into throughout the letters. Paul is, although happy about the expansion of the church, Paul also stresses division in the church, division among brothers. Telling everybody, oh, we argue with each other like with Apollos and Cephas and John, and I don't care about all these other pillars, and he says in Galatians, and in 1 Corinthians when he talks about the Apollos and John and Cephas and the others, in James also. He seems to be very stressed about the same issue. And then in Philippians somewhere, don't remember where, I think Paul said something about his death coming soon. And then in the Epistle to Philemon, he definitely implies it when he says to Philemon, oh, take care of Onesimus for me. And then he says, I am in my old age, my advanced age. And I'm like, well, it sure sounds like it's being written shortly before Paul meets his demise. And then, and this is like, where was I? I'm trying to remember. There was, yes, Pliny's letter to Trajan. Oh yes, I love this part. In that letter, Pliny says, Velius Paulus imprisoned Flavius Archippus. And when I thought about that, I'm like, man, that sounds that sounds a little bit like the Epistle to Philemon, doesn't it? You know, Paul's saying, "Oh, I'm in prison," and he writes to Onesimus, which is interesting because Onesimus he calls his begotten son in my chains, and then, which if that, I mean, he's kind of being specific there. That would, if he means what he's saying there, that would mean he's contradicted his celibacy, and then, Archippus is mentioned, a Christian called Archippus. And I had to think to myself, Mike, is that the same? Because think about the household for a minute, Caesar's household, right? Yep. Flavius Archippus. Looks like he's a kinsman to the Flavian dynasty that met its demise about a decade before he was imprisoned. 1 to 2 decades before. When I read Philemon, it doesn't sound like Archippus' imprisonment has happened yet. But adding on top of the evidence that he seems to be working with the Caesar's household, Roman governors, and other stuff. And him knowing Josephus, that is. It looks to me there's a really good chance that is Flavius Archippus. The possibility shouldn't be dismissed on top of the other evidence. The best part, what makes the evidence very strong as a whole, is that the evidence piles up, and with the names all being in common with the same household as the one Josephus and Pliny is talking about. That's what makes it difficult to dismiss the Caesar's household as being a coincidence, as some scholars try to dismiss it. And then let's go back to King Aretas.
Uh-huh.
When Paul says he was lowered from a window in a basket, does that remind you a little bit of Moses' nativity story?
Sure.
Yeah, because it does to me. I'm like, okay, so not only is he confusing one Aretas for the other, 100 years apart, but the story sounds to me like he's importing the story of Moses and grafting it onto himself. And Paul says other strange things, like, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, Benjamite, Pharisee, which, by the way, no genuine Pharisee would believe the stuff he believes. I mean...
You know what else is interesting, too, in relation to that? I don't know if it would be connected at all to that, but I'm sorry, because I haven't been in this literature for so long, I can't make the correlation, but he's the famous Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Yes.
He is let down while the 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple. The Rome army has
right.
Jerusalem surrounded, and so the narrative for Judaism to survive, because Yochanan ben Zakkai is the perpetuator of Judaism, he is put in this wooden casket and carried out by 2 of his disciples. And he gets stopped by the Roman guards, and what are you doing? You can't leave the city. And please, our rabbi just died. We need to honor this man and bring him outside the city. So they attempt to drive a stake through the casket, but they get deterred from doing that, and they ended up bringing him out. So it's not exactly the same, but it's another narrative of being let down or let out of the city under a distress. So I like your connection to Moses in a basket. The basket motif is interesting.
I think it fits wonderfully. Everything is Clemens fleeing from, I can't remember the guy's name. I think it was either Vitellius or Otho that was coming to lay siege to the household of the Flavians. Clemens was fleeing, and it sounds just like Paul too, fleeing from Aretas. I absolutely think that's connected. And Ben Zakkai thought Vespasian was the Messiah, just as Josephus does. They all have the same central theme, even Paul, that God has gone over to the Roman side, or as Paul would say, Paul doesn't say it like that, but Paul says in Romans about the governments on earth exist because they are appointed by God. So he doesn't have to directly say that God went on Rome's side. He's saying any government that rules Judea, that would include Rome, obviously, you should obey 100%, because God must have appointed them. That's Paul's argument, and that's why I tend to think, I don't have a problem with these others being authentic, but to jam these letters into the 50s, as some of these guys are. Okay, here's some names I had trouble remembering earlier, I think. Rainer Resner, I'm not sure if I pronounced his last name correctly, in Paul's early period chronology, mission strategy. He suggests Aretas's troops controlled the city, or something to do with the official and control of a Nabatean community in Damascus and not the city as a whole. And then others like John Barton and John Mudderman in the Oxford Bible commentary, they really try to force the issue by making Aretas as having briefly annexed Damascus. I'm like, no offense to those guys, but like, we're not told this anywhere, not even by Josephus Flavius. It's kind of like, I hate to say this, but I'm like, y'all kind of making stuff up to try to make it fit with Paul's error in 2 Corinthians. Like, the funny thing is, had it been anything else saying this other than Paul, had anyone else said this, any other religious text, they probably wouldn't even be defending it like this. I'm like, come on, guys.
Yeah,
come on, don't make Paul...
This matters.
Yeah, don't make Paul right when he's not.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then added on top of all the other evidence, the same shipwrecks, Banus and Barnabas, and the whole 9 yards. It looks to me a mid-90s date would fit better for the letters as being written shortly before Paul's death. And because Paul's, in all letters, is the same theme. Division in the church. And then Philippians and Philemon, his death is coming soon, especially in Philemon. And so that's why I think it was much later into the first century. This doesn't I don't think this changes, in my opinion, it doesn't change Paul's timeline very much. This means he lived longer. Now, with one exception, this might affect his birth, because it's estimated usually, Paul might have been born around 80, 10, 20. Don't know for sure.
Yeah, we have no hard evidence for that. There's no
there isn't.
Chronological beginning.
Yeah. However, here's an idea. 2 Corinthians 11:32. I thought about this recently. Now, there are other videos of me out there, me saying, this wouldn't work, but here's what I didn't think about at the time when I had that in mind. I was like, what if Paul is writing an analogy, some allegory about what was going on in Herod's family, comparing himself to Moses, by the way. Because that's when he was born. That's an idea I had. Like, if he was actually born on 37 AD instead of being an adult then, and he died in the mid-90s, as Clement suggests, then he was a Herodian. Maybe he says so in Romans. He was a Herodian, kinsman to the Herods, which is funny because, in Matthew's gospel, the Herods are supposed to be hunting down baby Jesus. And Paul is the great apostle who writes the letters. I'm like, oh, wow, that's certainly a conundrum for a Christian to think about. Anyway, if he were born on the year instead of being an adult then, that would kind of make sense why he tries to make that what happened to him on that year look like he was Moses, because his family was carrying him in a basket because he was a baby, not an adult. And he's like, I'm like Moses in that way. And like, you wouldn't, an adult being lowered down from a basket, so the way Paul's describing that in 2 Corinthians sounds a little absurd, especially when the story of Moses could easily be used to compare himself to Moses.
Yeah, especially in the community of Corinth, because Paul alludes to Moses in chapter 3 of that epistle, and also in the first epistle, and who knows whatever ones we don't have. So yeah, there's a familiarity.
Yeah, that's why I think a later date would resolve these issues. The people that he's mentioning would make better sense. Then there's Aquila. That's another person. I almost forgot to bring him up. Aquila. And then this is an interesting name because there's another Aquila, famous Aquila in the 2nd century, identified with Onkelos, whom
yeah, that's right.
Something to do with the Targum and the Torah and the translations.
The translator,
yeah. And I'm like, could that be the same guy Paul's talking about? Because if it is, on top of the other people we know live later for sure, then that would make sense with the other bunch that lived and died at near the end of the first century and the early second century. So that's what it seems like to me. It all adds up to that. The evidence just piles up together to the group, that group of people having been the same group of people being talked about in that literature. And then the other thing is, Professor Eisman suggests that Saul, the kinsman of Agrippa, that Josephus mentions a few times in Jewish Wars and Antiquities, is actually Paul himself. Now, in Acts, it makes a big thing about Saul becoming Paul, that Paul in Acts 22, and I think, in Acts 26, I think, as well, Paul goes back and forth saying, I was previously called Saul. And he kind of mixed that in with his authentic letter to the Romans, the Epistle to the Romans, that you kind of got to ask yourself, okay, well, kinsman to the Herods, I was previously called Saul. I'm like, that does sound like that guy that Josephus is talking about, Saul, the kinsman of Agrippa. And in the 60s, around 66 CE, when it started the war, Josephus says that Saul and Costobarus, his brother, were rescued by the Romans. A battalion of Romans or a legion was sent to rescue them. And that same incident is discussed somewhere in Acts or even in one of the letters. I don't remember where, but somewhere in there, Paul got rescued in a very similar way. Yeah, in Acts, Paul flees. He actually flees the Jews. He flees Damascus to get away from the Jews. But it's not fleeing from Aretas. He's fleeing in the 60s. It's the same event mentioned in 2 Corinthians, but it's 30 years apart. Or, well, more precisely, about 35 or 30. Yeah, 35 years. No. Hold on. Yeah, it's about 30 years apart. So it sounds to me that Acts is correcting the error in 2 Corinthians.
I think.
Well, what happened? I'm sorry. What was that?
Well, I think Acts does a lot of that. That's probably its purpose, is to correct a lot of, or clean up a lot of these loose ends. If you just have Paul's letters, or it cleans up the Christian narrative and sets it forward for the centuries on. Absolutely.
So it looks like, and Acts, as we all know, it's not always wholly reliable. It makes its own mistakes, but it does correct Paul. I think it probably, well, not probably. I mean, Josephus pretty much confirms it. Paul's escape as an adult, his real one, happened in the 60s. And Acts confirms this, and it corrects the error that Paul made in 2 Corinthians. And this really, like, the other thing is, like, scholars would say, oh, Paul's letters they're very reliable. And then the funny thing is, oh, but we know he's wrong about Jesus. I'm like, well, if he's wrong about Jesus, and Jesus didn't believe any of the crap that Paul puts in it, is claiming that he believes, then it's, not very reliable. And then Paul doesn't know which Aretas it is in the first century, or more like he confuses one for the other. I mean, there's a lot of mistakes in there. And then, obviously, Josephus' life seems to be shared in with Paul. A bit as if they knew each other, and then you got Paul using the Old Testament to describe himself. Like the Old Testament Saul, he says, oh, I'm a Benjamite. It comes from this Saul the Benjamite. And I'm like, yeah, there's enough Old Testament pesher going on here. But I'm like, okay, he's making some stuff up about himself to exaggerate his life and his importance. Like, oh, you see, I'm so like these other people that I'm talking about. You guys gotta listen to me, man. Y'all gotta listen to me. Yes, that's what, when I read Paul's letters, that's what it sounds like to me when I'm reading them. It's like he's just begging people to listen to him.
Trying to become relatable to his audience.
Yeah, that's what I think. And I do agree with Eisman. I think the best evidence for his claim is in Romans and in Acts. In conjunction with Josephus, it does sound like that Saul guy is Paul. And the interesting thing is Josephus never mentions Saul's death, which goes along with Clement whom is writing after Josephus already wrote everything, and he says, oh, but Paul died recently, so it looks like Paul died after Josephus wrote his stuff, shortly thereafter. And here's the interesting part. Josephus has no knowledge that Saul called himself Paul. No knowledge of that. Now that right there interests me, because like, okay, well, if we go at the mid-90s as the correct time period for Paul's letters, and he's writing them near the end of his life, as it's heavily implied in Philemon, then that would explain quite a lot. Josephus is not aware of the Paul tradition, Saul turning into Paul, because it hadn't happened yet. That's what it looks like to me. He didn't use the pen name Paul yet, which is he's just using which is obviously loosely based on his own name. So substituting the S for the P.
So you're thinking Josephus, because Josephus, what is he commonly understood to write? Antiquities and Wars somewhere in the early 90s?
He wrote he got Wars published on 75 CE, and he got Antiquities published on 94.
Okay, so you're saying Paul's letters then, therefore, with this, would have to be written after Antiquities.
That's what I believe.
Which is plausible. I don't know what the date for Clement is. But
scholars typically say Clement is around 95, 96 CE. Now, there are some others. There's a group of other scholars, including Dr. Richard Carrier, he's a mythicist, as you know, and he says that Clement was written before 70, and that's a minority position in scholarship. And he says this because
Absolutely.
You've heard of that?
Yeah, I don't think I don't know of any people who would really accept that.
Yeah, I can tell you why he said this. He said this because Clement seems to think that the temple hasn't fallen yet, but he doesn't say the temple has or hasn't fallen either. He doesn't specify. He's not specific about it. He's concerned with Jesus being a high priest, which is interesting. It sounds like Hebrews. He says Jesus is a celestial high priest in heaven somewhere, and even on earth simultaneously. So I'm like, well, that sounds a lot like Hebrews 4, Hebrews 7, Hebrews 8, which said Jesus was a high priest of something to do with the order of Melchizedek. And I'm like, it almost sounds like it was written by the same guy, which, by the way, Origen of Alexandria said it was either Clement or Luke that wrote Hebrews, but only God knows which one did it. Although Luke isn't as specific as Clement is, which is why I think Clement wrote it. Because Luke never did.
Yeah, I think that's an option. That's a contender that Clement is the author of Hebrews.
And it looks to me that Hebrews probably was written shortly after Paul's letters, because Paul has no knowledge of a tradition saying, "Oh, well, Jesus was a high priest." He never mentions it. Not familiar with it. So Hebrews seems like it's in between Mark. I think it's in between the Gospel of Mark and the Pauline letters, because in Mark seems to be reacting to Hebrews somewhat, because but what has me convinced of this is that in Mark it says that Jesus was anointed at Bethany. That's something that's pretty much mentioned in all four Gospels, I believe. Then and it mentions Mary and Martha of Bethany. And Mary was the one that poured the oil on Jesus, I think it was. And Professor Eisman noted in his works, he mentioned in the Talmud there was a Mary and Martha Boethus, whom he believes are the same ladies. Because there's no evidence of an earlier Mary and Martha that sounds like them. And that, if you think about it, that doesn't necessarily contradict the gospel chronology, because it never tells you when Mary and Martha died. At least I don't remember the gospel saying when they died. Yep. I figured as much. So the Talmud suggests that the two of them seem to have died in the late 1st century, which sounds, why not? And then, now here's the best part. They have a Jesus as a brother. Josephus says Jesus, son of Gamala, the high priest of Jerusalem in the mid-60s, says that he married his own sister. He doesn't name her, but the Talmud mentions the same Jesus as Yeshua ben Gamala, and it says that he married Martha Boethus. So I'm like, well, according to Josephus, he mentions her without naming her, they're sister and brother. I mean, I'm like, what? That sounds just a little bit like not only what Hebrews is saying, actually a lot like it. It sounds a lot like Mark, and it sounds like it. That's why I suspect Mark read Josephus, and he's like, well, let's confuse one Jesus for the other, or instead of doing that, because it calls him Jesus Christ, it doesn't call him Jesus from Gamala, or son of Gamala. Instead, it says, well, these attributes belong to Christ, and it sounds like to me it read the story of this Jesus guy and attributed his life, although backdated it to fit Jesus's time frame that Paul gives him for the 30s. It's like it's overlaying another Jesus with the earlier Jesus, and now he takes upon the likeness of that later Jesus. That's what it looks like to me is going on, not only in Hebrews but especially in Mark. Mark is like, oh, I can do this because obviously Hebrews is doing it, so let me do my own spin. That's what it looks like to me. And then in Matthew talks about Zacharias son of Baruch, and Adam Clarke in the 19th century CE, he says that Zacharias son of Barachias mentioned in Matthew is the same one as Zacharias son of Baruch mentioned by Josephus, which is interesting because in Matthew he was stoned by the Jews and executed in the middle of the temple, between the temple and the altar. I'm like, well, Josephus says the same thing about another Zacharias that died in the 60s. I'm like, around 68 CE, which is, by the way, at the same time Jesus, son of Gamala, got it. Jesus, son of Gamala, actually was killed alongside Ananias, son of Ananias, the guy that murdered James, the brother of Jesus. And says, and the reason why is because Josephus, if I remember correctly, I do know Josephus said that the Jews killed them as traitors. The part I'm not sure about, but I'm pretty sure he said this. Josephus appears to have said that they were accused, Ananias was accused of being a spy, working for Emperor Vespasian. I'm like, oh well, that would do it. If we were to figure something like that out, of course they're gonna kill him, which is exactly what happened. And that sounds like Acts. Ananias and Sapphira, Peter damned them. Like, you two didn't pay your I think it was a tithe. You didn't pay your 10% or whatever to the Holy Spirit.
They didn't give everything they had.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
They're supposed to sell everything and give it all to the church, and they kept a little bit for themselves. And because they did that, that wasn't good enough for them.
And they both die. They both fall down and die. I'm like, well, that sounds a lot like what's going on in the 60s. The Ananias guy sounds just like what Acts is saying. Ananias and Sapphira. It sounds like it's a parable that's derived from the account in Josephus. And yeah, that's what I think is going on here. I think if you just put a late dating with Paul, it'd fix it. It doesn't change. Most of Paul's life stays the same. Just a couple of major changes, but most of everything else stays the same. If it doesn't contradict Jesus' chronology, because here's the thing: unlike with Paul, overall in the New Testament and in Josephus, when he briefly mentions Jesus, the 30s chronology seems to be airtight for Jesus. He died somewhere between 26 CE to 36 CE in the 10-year reign of Pontius Pilate as the procurator of Judea, or prefect as he's sometimes called. And the only issue we have really is with Paul. And once you fix that, it's done deal. It's just everything makes better sense to me. I mean, does it solve every issue? I think there's always going to be an issue here and there. But
I think this, not that you are out to necessarily defend Christianity or defend the Pauline narrative, but I think this theory of yours can be, for someone like you, for someone like me, someone like my father-in-law, mythicists, people with Roman provenance, and also Christians alike. I don't think this hinders belief. I mean, I think you have to get at the bottom of why does Paul need to be written in the early 50s or whatnot. But I think you clear it up so it works nicely for both people. You don't have to lose your faith, and we can understand things better historically, as you're trying to do. So that is fascinating. I think if you look into it more, which you discuss it well, I think I'm just trying to articulate this well. You can probably counter whatever argument someone could conjure to defend an earlier narrative based on really Paul's age. and we can't really guess Paul's age just because Paul was meeting with Cephas and James, so he has to be a contemporary with them. Doesn't mean he can't be 15, 20, 25 years younger than them, and therefore
Exactly.
live into the 90s. Anyway.
And Paul called them super apostles too. The super apostles, I mean, they were earlier than him. So, I mean, yeah, it all fits very nicely. Now, there's another thing I want to point out just real quick. Paul's second Adam. This character I'm very fascinated with in Paul's literature. He says that this guy is 500 brothers had seen him. He says 500 brothers had seen Christ after he died. They had a mass vision of this guy, a mass appearance in 1 Corinthians 15. In Romans 1, he says that Jesus has a Davidic bloodline. And I had to think to myself, if I try to imagine those things, because here's the thing, Paul's Jesus is very different from the historical Jesus Josephus briefly mentions. And obviously, a crucified Jewish rebel is not going to be given in a tomb. Or this is ridiculous. But there is someone that fits all of those qualities in Josephus that I did tell you about before, but I didn't know about these parallels. This made my case for it stronger, way stronger than the last time I spoke to you about this guy. And this has something to do with King Monobazus. Before I go back to Bazus, let's talk about something that happened on 4 BCE. Josephus says that Zamaris, he says this in, I think it was Antiquities Book 2. Zamaris fled Babylon due to something to do with disputes with foreigners, and I think foreigners, and something to do with troubles in Looming and Parthia, something to do with zealots. Certainly the Parthian part. He fled, and the interesting thing is his royal guard. 500 cavalry. Josephus says 500 cavalry escorted this guy, and he called him the king of the Babylonian Jews. So he flees to Israel on 4 BCE, and he's given land called Bathura, sounds like Bethany, by Herod. The guy that's supposed to be hunting down baby Jesus is giving land to this guy. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting to me right there. I'm like, I wonder if Paul was aware of this guy. I mean, 500 brothers had seen Jesus and calling him Adam as well. Because, calling Jesus Adam is obviously pesher, because what happened to Adam? He was exiled in the book of Genesis. Zamaris, he was exiled. Jewish, 500. I'm like, I mean, that really just sounds, the parallels are just really powerful here. And then, here's the best part. Zamaris rules Babylon, and Josephus says he traveled from beyond the Euphrates. I'm like, in Jewish wars, Adiabene, Bazus' kingdom, Josephus says they are beyond the Euphrates. I'm like, okay, Josephus, it's the same people, same family as that guy. Yeah, that's what this is. Now, here's the end of it. Bazus apparently rules that kingdom throughout that entire period that Zamaris fled. Now, Bazus was also called Monobazus, which Bazus is obviously a short name for Monobazus. And it occurred to me, you know what? This is not the guy's name. That's a title. Because what Monobazus sounds like two words. Monobasileus in Greek, which means single king, only king. And then there's Emmanuel, God is with. It sounds like Monobazus sounds like it's not a perfect variation of Monobasileus. But it also sounds a little like Emmanuel. It's like it's a fusion between the two.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, Emmanuel Monobasileus, God is with the single king. God is with the only king. That's what that name sounds like to me. I'm like, well, if that's not a name, that's just some title combining a Greek word with a Hebrew word, then it sounds like it's another name for Zamaris. Mind you, we're not ever told these two ruled together. No co-rulership. It's either one or the other. I'm like, that sounds like it's the same guy to me.
Yeah, one and the same.
Yeah. So Zamaris, Jewish king, exiled, 500 guys. I'm like, oh, come on, this is the second Adam. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't appear to identify him with Jesus. Sometimes in other places he will, but also another thing to point out. In Antiquities, I think it was 18 to 20, somewhere around book 18 to 20, Josephus says that Monobazus was entombed. He received a tomb. I'm like, oh. With all that added together with those parallels of 1 Corinthians 15, it's just too good. It sounds like he's applying the entombment of this king, which a king would be entombed, of course. Queen Helena received an ossuary, which we have. And Helena had an ossuary. She was buried in the ossuary when she died. And she was the sister wife of Bazus, kind of like how Martha was the sister wife of that other Jesus, son of Gamaliel. I'm like, well, the high priests were corrupted, and Jews were very angry about that for a long time, saying, oh man, they're marrying each other's family members, they don't follow the law, and the whole 9 yards. I'm like, yeah, this is adding up. There's a lot of links here. At the Adiabene, the high priest of Jerusalem, they think alike. They're both pro-Roman, very pro-Roman. That's why Herod the Great gave the guy land. And it would also be a good buffer state between the troubles in the Middle East and with Herod's kingdom. Kind of keep Bazus in between. Okay, I'll protect you, Bazus, but help me protect my kingdom. It sounds like it's something like that that's going on. I'm like, here's the other part. Zamaris had a son called Jason. I'm like, doesn't that just sound like James, the son of Zebediah? James, the son of Zebedee in Acts? I'm like, well, that just sure does. And then Jason had a son called Philip. I'm like, the bodyguard for Herod Agrippa II. I'm like, oh man, that sounds like Philip the Evangelist. It just adds up. A lot of very identical names. Even if the two Philips weren't the same, Philip, the name is often, it's a Hellenistic, scenario there that's going on in the New Testament. I'm like, the groups that Paul refers to, the groups that Acts talks about, it's the same names, same location, same attributes, same thought process. Paul was anti-circumcision. And what did Josephus say about the Adiabene? Ananias, same guy, is going to Adiabene about 30 years before he murders James. And he says, he debates Eleazar. It sounds a lot like Paul and Cephas, and it sounds like Ananias and Peter and Acts, and this guy saying to Eleazar that Izates, Prince Izates at the time, should not circumcise. I'm like, an anti-circumcision scenario at Adiabene. Well, that sure sounds like Paul's ministry. It sure sounds like Ananias of Damascus, whom Eisman does identify with Ananias of Damascus. I'm like, yeah. It sounds like, even if it wasn't Christianity as we know it, even if Christianity started just a little later than we thought, regardless, we know there was a time that they didn't call themselves Christians. They were something else. Very different from the way we know them now, but also very similar in their own ways. Like the anti-circumcision that they still believed in both then and now. So, Ananias is preaching the same message Paul is. And the absurd idea that Jesus is a son of God, he ascended to heaven after he died. He also pre-existed as the son of God. He came into the flesh. So I'm like, man. And then I had to think to myself, I'm like, well, the Ptolemies, the Roman emperors, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, they all had this tradition of after the head guy dies, the emperor, the pharaoh, or the king dies, he ascends to heaven, becomes a god, or ascends to the underworld, whichever way, depending on who it is that's saying it. I'm like, that's the same way Paul. That's the same way Paul's preaching about Jesus. He's like, he's emulating these rulers that are nothing like the Jewish kings, like the Hasmoneans. They're totally unlike the Hasmoneans, in which Paul says about those foreign. In other words, what I'm saying is he's attributing the same way that people portray the Roman emperors, the pharaohs of Egypt, to Jesus. A ruler that dies, an exiled guy without a throne. That's why he even calls him Adam. On top of that, with the 500. Oh yes, here's the additional evidence. Edessa was called Antioch.
All right.
Paul preaches at Antioch. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there are 3 different Antiochs. I get that. About 3 or maybe 4 of them. And Paul is preaching at Antioch. But if you combine all the other unique parallels with Paul's mission, it kind of makes you wonder, is the Antioch he typically refers to, is that Edessa? Because Edessa and Adiabene were ruled by the same family. Helena was the queen of both kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
As Moses of Corinth, very late historian, but he does say Queen Helena was the queen of Edessa, while Josephus says she was a queen of Adiabene. It sounds like Edessa and Adiabene seem to be interchangeable. Professor Eisman thinks that as well. I agree with him. It seems like it's the same family. And then there's this very late source, Procopius' History of the Wars of Justinian. And he says, can't remember if it's in book 2 or book 1 or book 2, but he says that King Augarus stayed in the house of Emperor Augustus. I'm like, that sounds like Algar the Fifth of Edessa, who was the king of Edessa, and the husband of Queen Helena, one of the husbands. I don't think he's. It doesn't look like to me he is King Boethus, although he's similar in some ways. The problem is Tacitus seems to mention King Aquila of the Arabs, who was different. It sounds like later traditions confused the two, creating the mythologized King Algar V. Oh, and we have one coin of King Boethus dating to around CE 20.
All right.
We have none for King Abgar. Whereas I had to think to myself, that's peculiar. We have coins of Edessa from the late 1st century and 2nd century onwards, but none from earlier. And we have King Achabarus of Edessa. I'm sorry, not of Edessa, of the Arabs. Tacitus doesn't specify what he means by Arabs, like which kingdom that was. Just some Arabian kingdom. I mean, it sounds like he got confused with Boethus along the line, creating the more mythologized King Abgar. Now, here's the thing. King Aquila is talked about a lot by Tacitus. Tacitus says that King Aquila was an ally of King Azates. Oh, well, you kind of see what happens there. Aquila is associated with the Adiabene by Tacitus. It wouldn't take much for someone like Moses of Corinth to make a lot of mistakes and say, well, for some reason, that guy's really Boethus when he's not. And he creates a combined narrative. That caused later historians to create the combined narrative of King Augarus. Moses of Corinth also said that Abgar was exiled from Edessa. He seems to be borrowing this from the account in Josephus. Zamaris was fleeing from Babylon. So I'm like, okay, so that's what it is. When I first spoke with you, and I didn't notice these things that I notice now,
Mm-hmm.
I knew there was something going on, but I wasn't looking at the full picture. I should have been focused more on Paul in conjunction with this guy instead of the Gospels, because the Gospels are quite frankly a mess. They're attributing, well, quite frankly, different lives of different Jewish rebels to Jesus. Different people are being applied to Jesus. Old Testament characters are being applied to Jesus. Like even Matthew saying, oh, Jesus being dead for 3 days sounds like Jonah. Matthew actually says that. I'm like, just as Jonah was 3 days in the whale, I think that was Matthew 1. I can't remember where, but he says this
12,
in Matthew.
12 or 15 somewhere.
Yeah, I think you're right. So, but it's definitely in Matthew's gospel. So I'm like, if the Gospels are laying over Jesus with conflating him with different characters, he's a mess, he's all over the place. I'm like, perhaps we should throw the Gospels out. Because, every time a historian looks at the Gospels, they get a different answer about Jesus. Not every time, but most of the time. I'm like,
Most of the time.
well, it sounds like the better answer is to look at Paul. And I also suggest perhaps we can tell what is or isn't so about the historical Jesus in relation to the Gospels if we were to compare the Gospels with Josephus simultaneously. I think it might help a little bit, maybe not too much in the long run, because again, the conflations are a huge problem either way. Primarily, I think Paul's letter should be regarded as the best evidence. in conjunction with Josephus about a historical Jesus. The other thing is, I would like to point out, on top of all the things that I've said about the second Adam being historically King Monobazus, and he's not Jesus. He's just conflated with Jesus in the letters, depending on exactly which one you read, or which parts of the same one you read, even. It sounds to me the second Adam and Jesus should be understood historically as separate characters, because in Josephus you got this guy who fits the second Adam like perfectly, but does not fit with the crucified Jesus. But you have the Jesus being recorded by Josephus, minus anything Eusebius threw in the Testimonium, that was pretty much crucified at the hands of Pilate. Apparently, and this is the interesting part, in Antiquities 18:3-1-2, just before he mentions him in Antiquities 18:3-3, Josephus says the Jews led some protest against Pilate for installing Caesar's effigies in Judea and Jerusalem and whatever. And it looks like Jesus' crucifixion happened just afterwards. And that got me thinking, was he the leader of those protesters? I think there's a real good chance he was, based on the way Josephus goes about it, minus the Eusebian nonsense that Eusebius threw in there. So yeah, that's what I think is going on. I think the second Adam is being conflated with Jesus, and I think Paul, because here's the interesting thing, Paul doesn't argue that Jesus, while on earth, was pro-Roman. He never says it like that. He says, I receive what Jesus believes in heaven. Jesus is communicating his revelations to me. I'm like, when I thought about that, it took me a little bit to think about this, because this confused me for a while. How could Jesus be preaching the narrative of a revolutionary? Then he has the nerve to confront James, the brother of Jesus, or the brother of the Lord. And he says, well, look, James, I knew Jesus better than you. He was actually pro-Roman. Everything you saw was some kind of hallucination. I'm like, what? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would he? That's so stupid. Why would he confront Jews that know better than he does and say it's the other way around and that Jesus was really pro-Roman? They wouldn't. How could he think in his right mind that would work? But what I realize that he's doing is he's doing something different. He's not quite putting it that way. He says, well, you see, Jesus is pro-Roman now, after he died. And it sounds like, oh, I see, Paul. That's some cliche you're pulling there. You're saying, well, Jesus repented his sins in heaven. You see, he knew that he made a mistake when he rebelled against the Romans. He's pro-Roman now. It's like, okay, guys, I screwed up. Stop rebelling. He's saying, it is through me. He's communicating through me to tell you. I regret my actions. I'm like, oh, wow, this is pathetic. This is pathetic. I think Paul's doing that. He's going up against these people and telling them, Jesus is now back to being an angel like he was before, and he's seen the errors of his ways, rebelling against God's appointed government in Rome, almost implying that Jesus sort of rebelled against God by rebelling against Rome, but then he cleansed himself of those sins and says, I am now pro-Roman once more. I'm like, okay, so that's what's going on here. Now I understand Paul a bit better. I see what he's doing in Galatians. I see that. I now see why he says Jesus is the second Adam, because he's comparing Jesus to what he should have been like on earth. The second Adam is what Jesus should have been on earth as he is now in heaven. That almost looks, that's what it sounds like to me when I read Paul's letters, that he's saying that. Not necessarily those exact words, but once you add up all the evidence, like I did, I mean, it should at least come across as something at least similar to that. If other people were to run by the evidence the same way I did, I would say there's a good chance they would get similar answers. Maybe not quite the same, but pretty close, because it does sound
probably
like that. I'm sorry, what was that?
Oh, I was agreeing.
Yeah.
One were to look at the same evidence, come to similar conclusions.
Now, here's something that bothers me a lot. James 5:6, which is, well, it's supposed to make you think it was written by Paul's opponent, James. And in James 5:6, it says, you murdered the righteous one who hath not resist you. I'm like, well, this sounds a lot like the pseudo-Clementine recognitions, which says the same thing about James. Paul and his group stones James to death in his group, and James refuses to resist Paul. I'm like, well, here's the problem. The Clementine recognitions knows Acts, and it knows the entire New Testament. So I'm like, it could be borrowing the way it expresses James from the Epistle of James, which I do believe it is doing. But the fact it would interpret it that way, that it's referring to James who have not resisted Paul, I think would support the idea that when James says, whoever James was, you murdered the righteous one who have not resisted you, it sounds like it's referring to Paul. On the other note, Jesus could be understood as a righteous one himself. It could be about him, but based on what the pseudo-Clementines are saying, based on how they interpret the Epistle of James, it's also highly possible it's actually talking about James. And in Josephus, you have James above the Lord, and then it almost sounds like the way Paul introduces that, he's being positive a little bit. Oh, you see, James the Lord's brother, and then he gets really angry. He says, "Oh, James Josephus refused to eat with the other people that haven't that refuse to circumcise." He's really pissed. I'm like, and Josephus has got up from the dinner table, getting away from the Gentiles, and he's really mad. I'm like, I mean, consider Galatians. Like being mid-90s based on the evidence. It looks like James, because here's the thing: pillars. When he says pillars, I think that's a predecessor to the term bishop. It's like these are different leaders of the church, different bishops, and these guys I'm disputing with. And he says, I don't care about those pillars, as he says in Galatians. So it almost looks like when I read Galatians, I couldn't help but think to myself, in conjunction with James 5:6, that two different Jameses are at play here. And I don't doubt Paul argued with James. I believe it happened regardless of when Galatians dated. I believe that's authentic. I agree that's authentic, historically. I don't think the dating Galatians matters to that. Paul confronted the same James that Josephus talks about that he calls the Lord's brother in Galatians. But at the same time, the way he shifts his attitude like that about James in Galatians reminds me of what's happening in the Epistle of James. And it reminds me of the pseudo-Clementine recognitions. Which, by the way, by suggesting that Paul murdered James, it's pretty obvious that it's confusing Ananias, the guy that murdered James, with Paul. Mm-hmm. And in Acts 9 and Acts 22, Saul or Paul meets Ananias at Damascus. He becomes the... That's when he changed his name from Saul to Paul. And I couldn't help but wonder, like, okay, it almost sounds like if you would change your name because you met somebody whom took you into the flock like that, the one thing that I think about is adopted son or spiritual son. Because if he changed his name after he met this guy, it almost sounds like, to me, an adoption of some kind. May not even be like a literal son, but like, you are my son in my church. Something like that. And Ananias being the murderer of James, and then Paul meaning small. I'm like, okay, why would he change his name to small or junior like that? Which is essentially what Paul means. I'm like, is he saying I am small Ananias? That's what it sounds like to me. And in pseudo-Clementine recognitions, it's saying Paul murdered James. I'm like, so that's what happened. He murders James because it's saying that he's no different than his mentor. Mm-hmm. Mentor like pupil, the murderer of James. And in Acts, it says Paul or Saul shows up after the death of the righteous one, which the mention of the righteous one is followed by the stoning of Stephen. And then Saul shows up and says, I approve of his death. Now, there was a Stephen that's executed by the Jews around 48 CE in Josephus, which according to Josephus, he was killed for being pro-Roman. Pro-Roman again, here we go. But at the same time, the way Acts says it sounds more like the death of James and Stephen. Obviously, the way it talks about Stephen's borrowed from Josephus' account of Stephen's death, but it also sounds like James's death at the same time. Because in Josephus, Professor Eisman somewhat talks about this, I think. Yeah. It says that Saul starts rioting in Judea. He starts moving around Judea just after the death of James is mentioned in the Antiquities. I'm like, well, that's the same sequence in Acts. The righteous one, followed by the stoning of Stephen, followed by Saul shows up and condones his death. I'm like, come on, that's the same thing. It seems like it's conflated Stephen and the narrative of James' death together. I think that's what the author of Acts did, and that's what caused the conflation between the two. As for the historical Jesus, I think the historical Jesus, based on what Josephus says about him, based on the fact Paul even says he's crucified, it sounds like he's no different than any of them other rebels that Josephus mentions, like Theudas the Egyptian, James, John the Baptist, Simon Bar-Gora, Menahem, son of Judas, or James and Simon, the other two sons of Judas that Josephus mentions. Sadik, Judas's second in the revolution, in 6 CE. Now, Sadik means righteous, which is interesting, and it just like the same thing talked about in the Epistle of James. James the Just is called the just, meaning righteous. Justus, righteous, or Zadok, whatever. And John is the baptizer of righteousness, according to Josephus. Is a little paragraph he talks about, and the little paragraph he mentions John the Baptist, and he says, Josephus never mentions, Herodias wanted John dead, and so she told Herod to do it. That's what the Gospels say. But in Josephus' version, he says, Herod Antipas feared John that he could cause a rebellion, so he executed him at the fortress of Machaerus, close to the Jordan River. And then you have Theudas, whom led a revolt against the Romans around 46 CE at the Jordan River. Governor Cuspius Fatus beheads him, parades his head in Jerusalem. It sounds like John the Baptist a bit, because he's preached at Jordan River. He said, I will part this river. Obviously comparing himself to Joshua in the Old Testament, who parted the Jordan River. So that's what it sounds like Jesus was originally. He seems to have been an empty vessel that Paul used to construct this pro-Roman vassal king framework by fusing him with the second Adam. And then he's trying to tell the Jews, you see, when he got into heaven, he saw the error of his ways. He sees the truth now. He's pro-Roman now, as he should have been, like the second Adam was. And now he's telling me to tell you, stop fighting the Romans. Give in. God put them there in the first place. He appointed them, right?
Yeah, if it's meant to be, it'll be. And it's
that's what it sounds like to me. Yeah. And the other thing is, Judas Iscariot, he's the guy that supposedly betrayed Jesus for how many shekels of silver was it? 12 pieces?
30, maybe?
30, yeah. 30 pieces of silver, yeah. And Iscariot, as some authors would note, sounds like Sicarii in Josephus Sicarios. And according to Josephus, the Jews committed mass suicide at Masada in 73 CE at the end of the war. And I'm like, the Sicarii committing mass suicide, Judas Iscariot committing suicide in Matthew's Gospel. that sounds really, really close to being like Judas Iscariot's suicide seems to be a parallel to the mass suicide of Masada. And calling Judas a traitor and Judas the Galilean being the founder of the fourth philosophy, the Sicarii, that Josephus talks about, it sounds like Judas Iscariot represents this movement and ultimately Judas the Galilean, the founder, and says, and that's why the gospel says, oh, he's a traitor to Jesus. You know, Jesus like, being pro-Roman's the right way to do things, but Judas betrayed me like he couldn't see it. It's simply absurd. And then John the Baptist, and this part I laughed at, like when it claims that John said that he is unworthy to untie Jesus' shoelaces or to tie them. I'm like, come on. I don't buy a historical John the Baptist revolutionary that Josephus talks about could have said such a ridiculous thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, come on.
Yeah.
I'm unworthy to untie your shoelaces. That was
I think what was the narrative I always heard about that was that there was later on a specific cult that worshipped or followed John the Baptist.
Yeah.
And so that part was supposed to not necessarily have happened historically, but it's
Right.
just supposed to communicate that Jesus is better than John. Hence, they have the John saying, "I'm not worthy to tie your sandals or untie your sandals," or whatever is going on with the feet.
I tend to think it's making John subservient to the pro-Roman Jesus to kind of that's propaganda.
Absolutely. It's propaganda to whatever the community or whoever would be interested in reading.
Because
that.
Josephus mentions that the crucifixion of the historical Jesus happened before John. So it sounds like in history, John was the successor, not the predecessor.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be the reason it says that in a way, that John's unworthy to untie Jesus' shoelaces because Jesus was the leader. But another text, I mean, in the majority of the gospel stories, I mean, it's pretty clear that John baptized Jesus, that he seems to be the leader. And but in spite of that, I mean, it also says that in the end. So the unworthy to untie your shoelaces scenario, and in Josephus, Jesus preceded John. So I think that's what's going on there. And even John is somewhat of an amalgam because Josephus doesn't say John preached at the Jordan River, but Theudas did. It seems like in the Gospels version of John the Baptist, they accumulated and attributed the narrative of Theudas over him. And Josephus, by the way, never mentions that John was beheaded. But then they talked about beheading Aretas, though. I'm like, and then Theudas was beheaded at Jordan River. I'm like, oh, okay, I see what the Gospels did here. They confused the beheadings probably deliberately, kind of like how Paul confused one Aretas for the other. In 2 Corinthians, what's new? So yeah, that's what I think is going on. I think there's a lot of conflations going on here.
Well, I would say after we talked a little over a year ago, you've definitely increased and done some more studious work, learned more about the connection of languages and names.
Yeah.
And I'd say your case is strong.
Yeah, I'm glad you see that.
Stronger.
Thank you. I'm glad you see that too, because I was hoping it would be, because the evidence I showed you, it's like I knew there was something going on. I knew I found something. Something's going on, but I'm not seeing the full picture. I didn't gather all the evidence at the time. But then later on I realized I should be focusing more on how Paul portrays the second Adam. That's what I missed. The second Adam is what really shows Bazus got imported into the New Testament. That's what shows it. Yes. And he's more like Zebedee. That's what's going on. And his son James, or Jasum, the son of Zamaris. Oh yeah, that's the son of Zebedee, James. Now some people might say, "Oh wait, Jacob, you're saying that James, son of Zebedee, is Jasum, but according to Acts, James was executed by Herod Agrippa." Oh well, kind of like how the second Adam got confused with Jesus. Well, in Josephus, he said James, the son of Judas the Galilean, was crucified in 47 CE. So that's what happened. They attributed his execution over to the other James. That's what happened. Simple as that. And that's actually, in itself, that's an example of two different characters being fused together. Just like in Paul's letters, the second Adam and Jesus. Yeah, there we go. That's what's going on. And this backflipping, character conflations, this is all deliberate. There's a lot of work to put in to make these confusions. They couldn't all be done by accident. They add up. There's a lot of them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a finely woven quilt of connected names and narratives, and like you're saying, different Aretises just being pulled up.
Right. Well, okay. I think that pretty much covers it. And I think we can end it there. I think that would be a good ending for the show.
All right. Well, yeah. Thank you for having me. Sorry it took forever to narrow down a time to meet.
Well, it's all good. I appreciate you for coming on, and thank you to everyone for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe. Check the links in the description, and I'll see all of you later. Thank you for watching. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.